Fixing the root, not the surface, expanded. Daniel had reached a place in his life where things finally felt a little more steady. He wasn't chasing attention anymore. He wasn't trying to say something just to be noticed. He wasn't counting how many times people agreed with him or how often they remembered his contributions. The shift had happened gradually. Not because people changed, but because he did inside. His perspective had deepened. And he could now see the difference between fixing something on the surface and understanding what truly needed to be addressed at the root. There had been a time when Daniel believed that if he just spoke louder or used more confident body language or mimicked how successful people communicated, he'd be heard. He tried to stand differently. He tried to use the right words. He practiced sounding more assertive, and some of that helped for a while. But it never felt fully authentic. It was like putting on a coat that didn't quite fit. And the more he tried to wear it, the more uncomfortable he became. He realized that these were surface fixes. They dealt with how he appeared, but not with what he believed. And unless he addressed the root, the part of him that didn't yet trust his own voice, none of the surface-level changes would last. So Daniel stopped trying to act confident. He stopped trying to imitate what he thought others wanted to hear. Instead, he asked himself deeper questions. What do I care about? What matters to me when no one's watching? What values guide the way I speak? These weren't questions with fast answers. They took time, they took quiet thinking, and they weren't always comfortable. But they helped him build something stronger than performance. They helped him build self-respect. Not the kind that comes from results or approval, but the kind that comes from knowing you are speaking from a place of truth. He realized that many people walk through life adjusting how they look, how they speak, how they behave, all to meet expectations. But very few stop to ask why those expectations matter to them in the first place. Daniel had once been the same. He had tried to fit in without understanding what he was trying to fit into. Now, he didn't want to just be included, he wanted to be understood. And that required honesty. It required clarity. It required going to the root. Fixing the root, for Daniel, didn't mean solving every problem. It didn't mean removing all insecurity or becoming a perfect communicator. It simply meant learning how to stay connected to what was real. If he felt unsure, he acknowledged it. If he didn't have the answer, he said so. If he had an idea, he expressed it with care, even if it wasn't fully formed. And when others responded positively, he didn't treat it as a reward, he treated it as connection. When they didn't respond, he didn't retreat, he reflected. This steadiness was the result of deep work, not quick tricks. He started seeing communication not as a way to perform, but as a way to connect. And connection didn't require perfection. It required presence. The kind of presence that comes when you're not rushing, not pretending, not trying to sound impressive, but simply showing up as you are, with sincerity and thoughtfulness. Daniel had practiced this quietly for months. Not for recognition, but for his own growth. He spoke only when he had something meaningful to say, and he listened deeply when others spoke. He made room for silence. He let conversations unfold instead of trying to control them. One afternoon, while mentoring a younger colleague who was struggling to be heard in team discussions, Daniel shared what he had learned. The colleague asked, "How do you get people to take you seriously?" Daniel thought for a moment and said, "You don't force it. You learn to take yourself seriously first, but not in an arrogant way, in a calm, grounded way. And once you do that, people usually follow." The younger colleague nodded, not because it was a groundbreaking idea, but because it felt true. That was the kind of truth Daniel now lived by, not the kind that sounds impressive, but the kind that makes quiet sense. Daniel's journey taught him that being heard doesn't start with volume or style. It starts with understanding what you're really trying to say and why. When you fix that root, when you clarify your intention, your values, your voice, then everything you say carries weight, even if it's soft, even if it's short, even if it's quiet. Because people can sense when something is real, looking. Back, Daniel was grateful he didn't give up when he felt invisible. He was glad he didn't chase shortcuts or fall into the trap of overcompensation. He had stayed patient with himself. He had taken time to grow not just in skill, but in self-awareness. And that kind of growth, he realized, is what lasts. He also noticed that many of the people who seemed confident on the outside were often hiding uncertainty. They too were performing, afraid to be misunderstood, afraid to be seen as unsure. And Daniel no longer envied that kind of confidence. He respected the quiet kind, the kind built on inner clarity, not outer polish. He had met a few people like that, calm, clear, thoughtful, and he admired how they made others feel safe to be themselves. That's what Daniel now aimed for. Not to be impressive, but to be authentic. Not to dominate the room, but to contribute meaningfully. In the months that followed, Daniel continued with his daily habits. Writing in the morning, reflecting on conversations, taking small pauses before speaking. These habits didn't take much time, but they helped him stay connected to what mattered. And as he stayed rooted, others began to trust him more. Not because he demanded trust, but because he embodied it. His words matched his actions. His tone matched his values. His presence was steady. One day, during a company-wide meeting, a senior leader unexpectedly asked Daniel for his input on a new project. In the past, Daniel would have hesitated, unsure whether his voice belonged in such a large setting. But now, he simply nodded, took a moment, and shared his thoughts with clarity and ease. He didn't rush, he didn't try to sound smart. He just offered what he had honestly. And when the meeting ended, he walked away without overthinking how he did. He didn't need feedback to validate his effort. He already knew he had shown up with his full presence, and that was enough. Fixing the root, Daniel realized, isn't something you do once and forget. It's something you continue to do quietly and consistently. It's a commitment to knowing yourself better each day, to listening before speaking, to choosing clarity over complexity, to staying honest when it's tempting to impress. That's what he had learned. That's what had changed him. Not the surface skills, but the inner shift. Years later, when Daniel looked back on this chapter of his life, he didn't remember a single moment that changed everything. He remembered the mornings of quiet writing, the pauses before speaking, the questions he asked himself in silence, the slow building of self-trust. These small acts, repeated over time, were what helped him grow not into someone new, but into someone more rooted in who he already was. He smiled at that thought. Because in the end, that's what he had truly wanted, not to become louder, but to become clearer. Not to stand out, but to stand firm. Not to impress others, but to understand himself. And once that root was strong, everything else began to grow naturally. Slowly, quietly, but fully. A moment of quiet respect expanded. It had been a few months since Daniel began making small daily changes. He had not transformed into a new person. He hadn't become the loudest voice in the room or someone everyone looked to for answers, but there was a subtle, steady shift in how he carried himself, how he thought, and how he communicated. This change wasn't obvious on the surface, but those who paid attention could feel it. Daniel no longer approached conversations with the same hesitation. He no longer filled his thoughts with doubt before speaking. He had learned to pause, think clearly, and speak simply. His words, once hidden behind over-explanations and soft uncertainty, were now more deliberate. Not perfect, not forceful, just grounded. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Daniel arrived early to the office. He liked coming in before the rest of the team. The silence of the workplace before the noise and movement began allowed him to settle in without pressure. He made a cup of tea, opened his laptop, and reviewed the notes he had written the night before. The team had a big meeting later that day, a strategy discussion involving a long-standing client whose needs had recently changed. Everyone was expected to bring ideas to the table, and Daniel had spent time the previous evening thinking through a simple but thoughtful approach that addressed the client's concerns while also aligning with the company's goals. As people began arriving, the atmosphere slowly shifted. The casual morning greetings, the sound of keyboards tapping, the short conversations about weekend plans, all familiar and steady. Daniel didn't feel nervous, he felt prepared. Not in the sense of having all the answers, but in the quiet confidence of someone who had taken time to understand his thoughts before sharing them. When the meeting began, the team gathered in a small conference room with large windows and soft lighting. The discussion started with updates, moved into challenges, and then opened up into brainstorming. One by one, colleagues offered their perspectives. Some spoke quickly, throwing out ideas with energy. Others focused on the risks, the timelines, the budget. Daniel listened carefully, taking in the threads of thought being woven around the room. When there was a short pause, Daniel took a breath and spoke. "I think we might be able to address both the timeline and the client's concerns by simplifying the process," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. The room quieted slightly. He continued, "If we reduce the number of internal steps and focus directly on the features the client actually uses, we can cut delivery time without sacrificing quality." He then paused, not because he was unsure, but because he had said what needed to be said. No extra words, no rushing. Just the core idea. There was a moment of stillness, not awkward, just still. Then someone nodded. Another person asked, "Can you walk us through how that might look?" Daniel smiled gently, opened his notes, and explained the steps simply. There were no slides, no complex terms. Just a clear path, grounded in listening, thinking, and practical understanding. Others began building on his idea. Someone suggested a tool that could support the process. Another added how it could be tested in phases. The discussion moved forward, not away from Daniel's point, but from it. It had become part of the center. Daniel didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel as if he had finally proven something. He just felt calm, present, a part of something that mattered. The others weren't reacting to his words with surprise or exaggerated praise. They were treating them with respect. And that, for Daniel, meant more than applause. It meant he was being taken seriously, not because he had changed who he was, but because he had learned to speak from a place of clarity and care. After the meeting, a colleague from another department passed him in the hallway and said, "I liked your idea. You explained it really well." Daniel simply replied, "Thank you," and kept walking. He didn't let the compliment inflate him, but he also didn't dismiss it. He accepted it with quiet appreciation. It was just a moment, a small, ordinary interaction. But it reflected something deeper, a quiet respect that had been growing. Slowly and naturally, over time. In the days that followed, Daniel continued with his routines. He wrote in the morning, kept his focus during meetings, and reminded himself that real communication starts with clear thinking. He no longer tried to dominate conversations. He didn't push himself to speak in every discussion. But when he did speak, people listened. Not because his voice was louder now, but because it had depth. Because it came from a place of thoughtfulness. Not performance. Daniel also began to notice how others communicated, not in a critical way, but with interest. He saw how some people used more words than needed, while others spoke only when they had complete certainty. He had once been like both at different times. Now he tried to find the middle space, speaking with care but not waiting for perfection. He knew that clarity didn't mean having all the answers. It meant having one answer you had thought through, understood, and believed in enough to share. At home, Daniel reflected on the changes he had seen, not just in how others responded to him, but in how he responded to himself. He no longer dreaded meetings or felt invisible in conversations. He no longer left discussions replaying everything he said in his mind. Instead, he left with a sense of presence. And knowing that he had shown up as himself, clearly and calmly, that was enough. He also realized that respect from others often begins with respect for yourself, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that comes from honest self-awareness. Daniel thought about his younger self, the version of him that used to sit in meetings with his thoughts trapped inside, afraid to speak, unsure if his words were good enough. He didn't judge that version. He felt compassion for him, because he knew that growth doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, through moments of quiet courage, through small decisions to try again, through the willingness to keep showing up, even when no one notices right away. He wrote that in his journal one evening. Sometimes the most important respect is the kind no one sees, the kind you give to yourself when you choose to stay calm, stay true, and keep going. That sentence stayed with him, not as a slogan or rule, but as a reminder of what he had learned, that being heard isn't always about speaking louder. It's about becoming clearer within and without. And when that happens, respect follows, not in a dramatic wave, but in a quiet nod. A moment of shared understanding. A recognition that your voice has found its place not because you fought for it, but because you grew into it. That was the moment Daniel had been waiting for, not applause, not recognition, but the simple feeling of being part of the conversation, not as an outsider trying to prove something, but as someone who had finally learned to speak with his own quiet strength. Small daily fixes expanded. Daniel didn't believe in overnight change. He had seen too many stories where someone suddenly transformed into a new version of themselves, as if a single moment could undo years of quiet struggle. His own experience had taught him that real change is slower, more like a shift in rhythm than a burst of energy. After those quiet mornings of reflection and writing, he didn't suddenly become a confident speaker or a magnetic presence in meetings, but something had definitely started. Not big, not loud, just small, gentle, like someone rearranging their room a little each day, moving one item, cleaning one shelf, opening one window. It was the kind of change you don't always see right away, but feel over time. He didn't make a checklist or set big goals. Instead, Daniel focused on building small habits, the kind that didn't take much effort but carried meaning. The first was his writing. That continued each morning 10 quiet minutes before the day began. Sometimes he filled a page. Other times, just a few lines. If he had nothing to say, he simply sat with the silence. It became a space not just for clarity, but for calm. Those few minutes gave him a sense of direction before the noise of the day started. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was just about beginning the day with intention. Another habit he formed was breathing before speaking. It sounded too simple to matter, but for someone like Daniel who often felt rushed when trying to contribute, this pause made a difference. In meetings or conversations, before he jumped in, he took a small breath and asked himself, "What's the one thing I really want to say here?" That question helped him focus. It stopped him from over-explaining or doubting himself. It didn't always lead to the perfect sentence, but it helped him speak with more clarity and less pressure. He also began to observe his own patterns. After each meeting, instead of replaying every awkward moment or wondering why someone didn't respond, he asked himself, "What did I do well today?" That wasn't something he had done before. Like many people, Daniel was good at noticing his mistakes but slow to recognize his growth. This gentle shift in focus helped him build quiet confidence, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that sits in the background, steady and calm. He learned to appreciate small wins, like sharing a short idea without overthinking it, or asking a question that led to useful discussion, or simply choosing not to speak when there was nothing meaningful to say. At work, Daniel didn't change his role or try to stand out. He kept doing what he was doing, just with a bit more presence. When he sent emails, he made sure the message was clear and simple. When someone asked for help, he paused before responding, making sure he really understood what they needed. These small acts of mindfulness didn't make headlines, but they had quiet power. People began to notice, not in dramatic ways, but in the way they listened just a little more when he spoke, or remembered something he had said in a previous meeting. Trust, he learned, wasn't something you forced. It was something you built through consistency, clarity, and calmness. Outside of work, Daniel applied the same approach. With friends, he tried to be a little more present. He used to worry that he wasn't interesting enough in conversations, so he often stayed quiet or agreed with whatever was said. Now he allowed himself to speak honestly, even if his thoughts were simple or unfinished. He found that people responded more to sincerity than to cleverness. When he asked questions, he really listened to the answers. When he shared something, he didn't rush to explain every detail, he just let the words be. These small shifts made his connections feel more real. He also paid attention to how he used his time. Daniel had always been careful with his schedule, but now he became intentional with it. He chose to spend a little less time scrolling through his phone and a little more time reading or taking short walks. During lunch breaks, instead of eating at his desk, he stepped outside, even if just for 10 minutes. That fresh air, the simple act of walking under the sky, gave his mind space to breathe. It didn't solve every problem, but it helped him return with a clearer head on weekends. He set aside time to reflect, not in a heavy or structured way, but simply asking, what helped me feel more grounded this week? And where did I lose myself? These questions weren't about judgment. They were about awareness. He learned that there were days when he felt scattered because he had skipped his morning writing or felt rushed because he hadn't taken breaks. But he didn't treat those moments as failures. They were just signs, gentle reminders of what supported him and what didn't. One thing Daniel became especially mindful of was his language, not just what he said to others, but what he said to himself. He noticed how often his inner voice was filled with uncertainty. Maybe this isn't important. I don't want to bother anyone. I'm not sure if this makes sense. These thoughts, while quiet, shaped how he spoke and acted. He began to change them not by forcing confidence, but by choosing more supportive words. He told himself, it's okay to speak even if it's not perfect. I can trust my thinking. I have something worth saying. These were small affirmations, but they helped create a more solid foundation within, over time. Daniel's sense of identity began to shift not dramatically, but steadily. He no longer saw himself as someone who had to earn the right to speak. Instead, he saw himself as someone who had always had something to contribute, even if he had to learn how to express it clearly. He stopped comparing himself to others who spoke with more ease. He realized that everyone has their own pace, their own rhythm, and their own way of being heard. His strength wasn't in being loud. It was in being thoughtful, clear, and present. There were still moments when he hesitated. Still times when his voice felt small in a room full of big personalities. But now, those moments didn't define him. He didn't retreat like he used to. He simply noted them, learned from them, and continued. The difference wasn't in how people saw him, it was in how he saw himself. That inner shift, built through small daily actions, gave him a quiet kind of freedom he no longer waited for the world to validate his voice. He validated it himself, each morning, each breath, each quiet step. And slowly, the world began to respond, not because he demanded it, but because he was now speaking from a place of calm understanding that made all the difference. Looking in the mirror, expanded, the morning after that long day at work, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight had just started to filter in through the curtains, casting soft, pale light across the wooden floor of his room. The city outside was still quiet, with only a few distant sounds of birds and early cars. It felt like the kind of morning where something could shift, even if just a little. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed for a while, just breathing, thinking about the meeting from the day before and the many times before that when his voice had gone unheard. There was no anger in him, only a soft, persistent curiosity, a need to understand what was really going on beneath the surface. He walked to the small bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and stood for a moment in front of the mirror. The face staring back at him looked tired, but not in a dramatic way. It was the quiet tiredness that builds up over time, when you feel like you're trying but something's still missing. He looked into his own eyes, not searching for answers, but simply observing. Then, without planning to, he asked himself, what is it I'm really trying to say? The question wasn't meant to be deep or poetic. It just came from a real place inside him, a place that was tired of being vague, tired of being careful, tired of not knowing. He kept staring for a while. There was no big revelation, just a gentle awareness that something was unclear, not outside him, but within. For so long, he had focused on how people reacted to him. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether he truly understood himself. Maybe people weren't ignoring him. Maybe they simply didn't know what he meant because he didn't either. It was a humbling thought. He stepped back from the mirror, dried his face, and sat down at the small desk in the corner of his room. There was a notebook there, mostly filled with half-finished notes and reminders. This time, he opened to a blank page and began to write. Slowly, he wrote, "What am I trying to say?" and let the question sit there for a while. Then he continued, "When I speak, I want people to listen, but what do I actually want them to hear?" He didn't rush. He didn't try to sound smart. He simply wrote whatever came to him. He found that his thoughts, when written down, weren't as scattered as they felt when he tried to speak them aloud. On paper, there was space to breathe. He could return to an idea, sit with it, and slowly understand it. This small act of writing before speaking felt like something meaningful. Like the beginning of a shift, over the next several days, Daniel made this part of his routine. Each morning, after waking up, brushing his teeth, and making tea, he would sit at his desk and write for 10 minutes. He didn't follow a strict plan. Some days he wrote about work, other days about life, and sometimes he just described how he felt. He noticed that his thoughts weren't always clear at first, but if he stayed with them patiently, they started to settle, like muddy water becoming clear when left alone. He wasn't trying to fix himself. He wasn't trying to become someone new. He was simply learning to listen to his own mind before expecting others to dot. As he kept writing, he began to notice patterns. He often repeated the same concerns. I don't want to say the wrong thing. What if people don't understand? Me? I feel like I'm always behind in conversations. These were not complaints, they were reflections. Honest admissions of the quiet tension he carried inside. And slowly, through this process, something became clear. Daniel was not just afraid of being unheard, he was afraid of being misunderstood. And because of that fear, he often tried to explain too much, too quickly, hoping to leave no room for confusion. But in doing so, he created more confusion. He realized that sometimes, in trying too hard to be understood, we become harder to understand. This awareness didn't come with judgment. Daniel didn't beat himself up. He just noted it and kept writing. He reminded himself that clarity doesn't come from pressure, it comes from space. And space requires patience, so he gave himself that. Over time, his writing changed. Instead of writing about why people didn't listen, he started writing about what he actually wanted to say. Not just in meetings, but in life. What did he care about? What did he believe? What mattered to him when no one was watching? These questions were quiet but powerful. They helped him connect with something deeper than the surface reactions of others. One morning, about 2 weeks into his writing habit, Daniel had a moment of unexpected clarity. He wrote, "Maybe the reason people don't hear me is because I haven't truly found my own voice yet." It was a simple sentence, but it stayed with him. He realized he had spent so much energy trying to be heard that he hadn't taken time to define what his voice was. Not just the sound of it, but the purpose behind it. What did he want his words to stand for? What kind of tone felt true to him? These were questions he had never asked before. But now they felt important. He started experimenting with small things. In conversations with friends, he tried to say less but with more intention. At work, he prepared a single point to share in each meeting, rather than trying to say everything. He still felt nervous sometimes, but there was a difference now. He wasn't just reacting, he was expressing. His words were simpler, but they carried more weight. And while not everyone noticed right away, he felt the change within himself. It was a quiet kind of confidence, not based on being right, but on being clear. Daniel's mornings became his favorite part of the day. Not because they were exciting or full of energy, but because they gave him space to reset. In those quiet hours before the world rushed in, he could hear himself without interruption. He didn't always find answers. Sometimes he just sat in silence, watching the steam rise from his tea. But even that was meaningful. He began to understand that the process of listening to yourself is just as important as being heard by others. In fact, one often leads to the other. One day, during a video call at work, a colleague said something that usually would have made Daniel second-guess himself. But this time, he didn't retreat. He waited for the right moment, then shared his thought in a calm, clear voice. It was just one sentence. Not a big statement, not a groundbreaking idea, just something simple that added to the conversation. And this time, someone responded. Not with applause or praise, but with real engagement. They asked a follow-up question. Others joined in. The conversation moved forward with his idea included. It was a small moment, but it felt honest. It felt earned. That evening, Daniel returned to the mirror. He didn't expect anything special. He looked at himself the same way he had weeks ago, but this time there was something different. Not in his appearance, but in the way he stood. He wasn't searching for answers now. He was simply meeting his own eyes with a kind of gentle respect. He knew he still had work to do. He knew there would still be days when he felt overlooked. But now he had something he didn't have before, a sense of direction. A sense that his voice, when rooted in clarity and calm, had a place in the world. He smiled, not a big smile, but the kind that comes from knowing something quietly important. Then he turned away from the mirror, made another cup of tea, and sat down to write again, not because he had to, not because it was part of a plan, but because it had become part of him. A space where his voice didn't need to be perfect, just real, and that he had come to understand was the first step to being truly heard. The unnoticed voice, expanded Daniel, had always been a quiet observer. In a world full of noise, where people competed to speak louder and faster, he often found comfort in silence. At work, he was the kind of person who arrived on time, did his tasks well, and rarely made a fuss. He believed that if he worked hard enough, his efforts would speak for themselves. But over time, he noticed something that slowly began to bother him. In meetings, when ideas were being shared and problems were being discussed, his contributions often went unnoticed. It wasn't that he was ignored in a rude or dismissive way. It was more subtle than that. People would simply move on to the next speaker or change the topic before he could finish. Sometimes they would talk over him without realizing it. Other times they would nod politely and then forget everything he had said. At first, Daniel thought it was just his imagination. Maybe he was being too sensitive. But as the months passed, the pattern repeated. His ideas were only taken seriously when someone else repeated them later in a louder, more confident voice. It felt like he was invisible, not just in meetings, but in conversations in general. He started to doubt himself. Was he not smart enough? Was he not assertive enough? These thoughts became a quiet background noise in his mind, never loud but always present. He didn't complain to anyone. He didn't express frustration. Instead, he began to retreat even more into himself. He told himself that it didn't matter, that the work was what counted. But the truth was, it hurt to feel unheard. Daniel's team was made up of smart people, most of them friendly and well-intentioned. There was Emma, who always had a quick opinion. There was James, who seemed to know how to say the right thing at the right time. There was Priya, whose ideas were always met with interest. Daniel respected them all, but he also noticed something. They were not necessarily saying smarter things than him. They were just saying them in a way that captured attention. They had presence. Daniel didn't know how to create that. He didn't want to be dramatic or fake. He didn't want to shout or push his way in. He just wanted to be heard for who he was. But that didn't seem to be enough. One particular meeting stayed with him. The team was discussing a client problem, and Daniel had been thinking about a quiet solution for days. When the discussion came to a pause, he spoke up, carefully explaining his thoughts. As he talked, he could see people checking their phones, looking around and waiting for him to finish. When he stopped speaking, there was an awkward silence, and then someone else jumped in with a completely different idea. His words had disappeared into the air as if they had never existed. That evening, Daniel sat on a bench outside the office building, watching the sky darken. He wasn't angry, just reflective. He asked himself a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Why doesn't my voice matter? It wasn't that Daniel had never been heard before. In small one-on-one settings, people listened. When he wrote emails or reports, his clarity came through. But in group settings, something changed. His voice softened. His thoughts tangled. His sentences became long and unsure. He realized that the issue wasn't just with the listeners. It was also with how he spoke. He often tried to explain everything at once, afraid of being misunderstood. In doing so, he confused others. His tone lacked energy, not because he didn't care, but because he was too careful. He wanted to be accurate more than he wanted to be persuasive. Back home, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, thinking about the day. His apartment was quiet, filled with books and plants, a reflection of his inner world. He opened his notebook and began to write not notes for work, but thoughts about how he felt. He wrote slowly, not trying to impress, just to understand. "I want to be heard," he wrote. "But maybe I haven't learned how to speak in a way others can receive." That sentence stayed with him. It was honest and humbling. It didn't blame others, it didn't make excuses. It just told the truth. Daniel began to reflect on other areas of his life. With friends, too, he often stayed quiet. In group gatherings, he preferred to listen. When he did speak, he chose his words carefully, sometimes too carefully. He wondered if people mistook his calmness for uncertainty or his humility for lack of conviction. He thought back to his school days where he had once been praised for being thoughtful and reserved. But now, in a fast-moving professional world, those qualities seemed to hold him back. Over the next few weeks, Daniel paid more attention to how others communicated. He observed the way people framed their ideas, the way they used their voice, the way they structured their sentences. He wasn't trying to copy anyone, he just wanted to learn. He noticed that the people who were heard the most often spoke. In simple, clear ways, they didn't over-explain. They didn't rush, they didn't try to sound overly clever. Instead, they focused on making their point easy to grasp. They believed in what they were saying. That belief made their words stronger. Daniel realized that he often didn't believe in his own voice. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he wasn't sure what he truly wanted to say. He would enter meetings with 100 thoughts, unsure which one mattered most. He would try to say everything at once and end up saying nothing clearly. That night he made a quiet decision, not to speak more, but to think more clearly before he spoke. He began to write one clear idea before each meeting, just one. Not a paragraph, not a list, just one message he wanted to share. He didn't worry about how it would be received. He just wanted to be clear with himself, and slowly something began to change. Not in how people treated him, but in how he felt when he spoke. There was less hesitation, less need for approval. His voice was still calm, still soft, but it carried more purpose. Even if people didn't respond immediately, he felt at peace with what he said. He wasn't speaking to be accepted, he was speaking because he had something to offer. And that quiet shift, though small, began to make a difference, not just in the room, but in himself. Daniel wasn't trying to be someone else. He didn't start talking louder. He didn't change his personality. He just became a little more clear, a little more focused, and a little more grounded. The need to be heard started to fade, replaced by the desire to express truthfully. That was enough. And in that space, his unnoticed voice began to take root, not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly, in the way that matters most.